Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. Today is the 24th of January, 2022, and the topic of today's discussion will be Christianity, sci-fi, and the motives of credibility. This will be a free-form discussion where I just share some of my thoughts engendered by my recent reading, and I'm eager to hear what you guys think in the comments section. So, recently I finished reading Hyperion by Dan Simmons, and it follows along the heels of some other reading that I've been doing recently, which over the spring of last year I read all of Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. Uh, 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 it's a 4-book series, or one long novel split into 4 books essentially. And then I also went ahead and took the liberty of reading the Book of the New Earth, which is sort of like uh, epilogue or a post note to the Book of the New Sun. And both of these science fiction works deal with religion in the context of a future civilization and future developments in human society that have propelled humanity in a direction that makes it harder and harder for the meaning making structures of traditional religions to make sense in their respective contexts. So, in the case of Hyperion, the story is it takes place in, I believe, the 29th century, in a setting wherein humanity has destroyed the Earth, and they've spread out to other solar systems and planets, and they're currently locked in a political and military struggle with both the AIs that have seceded from their civilization that they created, as well as a group of humans that called the Ousters that left the civilized quote unquote systems long ago and now are back and at war with the so-called web worlds. The story is told in the sort of format of Boccaccio's Decameron or Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I sort of identified it most strongly with the Canterbury Tales, and the idea is that these 7 pilgrims are have been invited on a pilgrimage by this religion who venerate a mysterious and deadly supernatural being that lives on the planet Hyperion called the Shrike. And each of the pilgrims has been touched, their lives has been touched by the Shrike in various different ways. And that all connects in together in the stories that they tell on their way to the time tombs to complete their pilgrimage. So I won't spoil too much of the story. That's just sort of the general outline. And then to give a general outline of the Book of the New Sun, it follows the story of a young torturer named Severian who grows up to leave his guild and gets entangled in a web of the web of politics in the latter day Earth when the sun is about to die. And the Earth is divided, as far as we know, into these 2 political camps: the Commonwealth, which has an autocratic leader, and the Askians, who are sort of a sort of highly evolved version of communitarianism or communism or some form of collectivism. And within the context of the story, Severian takes on the status of a saint or a godlike figure. He spawns a religion, and it deals very heavily with Severian's own faith in God and what the relationship between the sort of the old Earth religions from sort of our time period, or at least the old meaning-making structures from our time period, and how well that they endure into this future that's so far removed from our current day, and how those structures persist. So both of these stories, and like I said, I've tried not to spoil them too much. I'd just give it a rough outline. Both of these stories deal with something called the motives of credibility. So if you go to the Catholic Encyclopedia and you search up the word faith, later on in the article it will talk about the motives of credibility. So the Catholic Church has always argued that people, by the light of natural reason, can come to the conclusion that there is a God who created all of the universe and human beings. This would be something like the God of the Greek philosophers or the deistic philosophers. But in order to believe in the God of Christianity, who is revealed through not just natural reason, but also through special revelation, we have to rely on certain institutions that were tasked with carrying that revelation to human beings. And the sort the whether or not supernatural faith can be engendered in people is often related to what this article calls the motives of credibility. So supernatural faith is a sort of indwelling of grace that people receive. It's not in and of itself an intellectual exercise, but it can be influenced by certain features, certain motives, and it talks about this in basically in the sense of the institutional church and how credible it is that that the special revelation that they're conveying is accurate to what actually occurred. So in recent eras, for example, we've had a lot of scandal in institutional Christianity, and it makes people, for example, skeptical of the moral claims of Christianity. Some people are skeptical because they see that Christians don't uh, necessarily live up to what they preach. Priests have been found to be acting in predatory ways towards people, for example, and that's the exact opposite of how Jesus taught priests and church leaders to act towards the faithful. And so that would be an example of a motive of credibility that the church would be lacking, or that would diminish uh, a motive that would diminish the church's credibility. And certain things that we normally think about when we think about the motives of credibility are things like historical pedigree. So, for example, the Catholic Church would say that we have stronger motives of credibility because the Catholic Church has things like recorded apostolic succession, where we have lists of the pontiffs of Rome and the supreme pontiff all the way back to Saint Peter the Apostle, who of course received his office from Christ himself, who is not only man but also God. So that would be an example of an extreme historical pedigree, which, if you accept, constitutes a very strong motive of credibility. On the other hand, you might have a church that was founded by an influential reformer, say the Reformed churches founded by figures like Calvin and Zwingli, and we might think, have weaker motives of credibility because Calvin and Zwingli, while they may be learned biblical scholars and they may have a lot of insight, even if you believed that they were something like prophet figures, they're still 1,500 years removed from the events that they are claiming to be authorities on, whereas older apostolic churches claim to be preserving a tradition that stretches back to the time in which those events that are being described take place. So their motives of credibility, we might think, are stronger. This is a long digression to sort of get to my point. And my point is that in all of these science fiction stories, what strikes me, and it's very explicit in the story Hyperion, that when we talk about Christianity in the context of science fiction, the motives of credibility, or what makes the Christian story more credible, are very different. One of the reasons, for example, why Christianity in science fiction stories is considered to be a less credible explanation um, uh, for explaining how and why the universe is and why it functions the way it does, is it seems to me it's implied in many of the narratives that it's because Christianity in this hypothetical science fiction age is one system among many for explaining reality. So, for example, in the Hyperion, Christianity, or the Roman Catholic Church specifically, because one of the characters, Father Hoyt, is a Catholic priest, and his story very much focuses on the motives of credibility of the church and priests in the 29th century, who feel as though the church is dying out because they don't have any compelling evidence, essentially, to provide to the wider public, and they realize that fideism will just lead to a dying and decrepit church. So, for example, one of the light spoilers here, so you can skip ahead a few seconds. One of the characters in the story is a Jesuit priest who attempts to falsify archaeological records on a planet, suggesting that some long lost alien culture were engaged in Christian worship 3,000 years before Christ walked the earth. So the idea that's implicit in Hyperion, I think, is the idea that if Jesus Christ were really the Son of God, if he were really God incarnate, um, if God had the traits that the Christian religion implies that he does, then we would see more evidence of him in the wider universe, because we've explored all these planets and we don't find anything that sort of implies that the influence of the God man has gone anywhere other than Earth and its colonies and these specific people that just believe in this myth. And so that is an extreme negative impact on the motives of credibility. I won't talk about what exactly happens in the priest's tale in Hyperion, but suffice to say that's the sort of epistemic background that people are dealing with. In the Book of the New Sun, it's a little bit different because millions of years have passed. But there is an interesting line that I want to say it's put in the mouth of one of the Pellerines in the story, but it could just be something that Severian reads out of the Brown Book. And he talks about how the old religion or old beliefs are all reconstructed in later periods um, out of small sort of embers. So there are hints of this in the story. Like, for example, there are several short stories that are contained within the story that reference the angel Gabriel. So that's sort of one of the ways that it grounds the story. And then there are other elements of the story that sort of connect it to a Christian past, like the title that they give to their venerated religious figure, which is the conciliator. And this is, we might think, a by title for Christ, a conciliator or a reconciler between God and man. Um, and then there's also the um, the element of the claw of the conciliator. This is obviously meant to be a representative of a holy relic that it has healing powers by virtue of its contact with the conciliator, which is very similar to how Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians believe the relics of the saints contain certain graces or healing powers by virtue of their having been in contact with the, shall we say, grace infused or unpolluted bodies of the saints. And so um, we're working with two different epistemic paradigms in both of the stories, but in both of the stories, the questions remain essentially that Christianity, in its claim to be this universal religion that unites all things, that has God Himself uniting His essence with a human essence, um, we would expect the universe to be radically different than it is according to the sort of background epistemic framework that science fiction stories present. And this is Gene Wolfe is explicitly a Christian, or was. He's deceased now, and he puts this observation in several different characters in his stories. Like, for example, at one point, Pellerine in the Book of the New Sun basically calls out Severian and says that he, all you people are materialists. And I think what that line is just meant to imply is that there's just something about this, the epistemic frameworks of these science fiction stories that just presupposes materialism, presupposes naturalism, and in those in the way that the worlds are constructed, it does make it very hard to see the universal impact of Christianity. But at the same time, Christianity, we could turn this canon back on itself, right? There's this sort of implicit idea that in these stories that Christianity was credible in the 19th century, but it's not credible in the 29th century. And the reason for that is just because we haven't found any crazy indelible marks on the universe that the incarnation would have made. And that's, first of all, that's a topic under dispute. But second of all, we also might remember that Christianity itself starts as a religion in a particular part of the world. It's a parochial belief that was held by rural people mostly from, of course, it was people of all backgrounds, but it's people, Christianity is born in a rural region, backwater of the Roman Empire in Judea, and it quickly spread throughout the world by just the virtue of its message. So that again would be something that the encyclopedia would consider a motive of credibility as well. The fact that people were ready and eager to adopt Christianity, even at the threat of death, because of the compelling nature of the message, we might think. And I would encourage people as well to think about their moral sensibilities and how all the moral sensibilities of the modern world are influenced by the Christian story, and how we don't get things like a concern for universal human rights or human dignity without having the Christian story. If you just take Christianity out of human history, it would probably look a little bit more like the ancient world with its, never-ending tribal squabbles and slave states, and so on and so forth. And we can look at countries where Christianity never really took off, or it was sort of smothered in the crib, like, say, the Arab states, and we can see that's precisely what we find is extreme ethnic tension and autocracy and slave states. Anyway, I was going somewhere with this. But essentially, Christianity has always been a parochial backwater religion that just somehow failed upward and gained immense success by the virtue of its message. And when it failed, or in the instances where it's failed and where it started to be peeled back, it's not necessarily because people lost faith in Christianity itself. It's more that they started to pick apart the doctrines and follow all of these heretical sects who uh, emphasized one aspect of the religion over another. All forms of communism or socialism, for example, are really just heretical Christian sects in my mind. Um, but in that sense, we might think, if Christianity starts out as a parochial religion on old Earth, in the future, why would it not continue to be the case that sort of old, if it remains a parochial religion? So in Hyperion, for example, the Roman Catholic Church, first of all, they own an entire planet, but they still bemoan the fact that the church is dying. And I find that to be odd. I would feel like a church that controls an entire planet would be rather powerful, but I understand the sort of what they're getting at is the sort of sense of ennui, or the sort of sense that history is marching on past the church, um, which is always, I think, going to be the case, especially in technological society. And I think Hyperion actually has a very good critique of technological society, but perhaps more on that anon. Um, I'm sort of talking in circles, I think, but essentially, I want to leave with this: is that just because, and something these stories highlight, I think, is that just because we might have a religious system that is not necessarily on the top of the world or blatantly obvious, there are not stars in the sky that say Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, even though there is a cross in the sky, ironically. But literally a constellation that is a cross. But at any rate, we don't have any of these crazy, extravagant proofs written into the very fabric of the universe, but we shouldn't expect that to be the case. And I'll leave with a short example of what I mean. Is that I believe it was the invention of penicillin that was sped on by the fact that it was penicillin, or it was some other antibiotic. They found out that it was created inadvertently by Anatolian herdsmen who would put certain foods under their saddle to tenderize them before they cooked them, and the bacteria that it generated actually had antibiotic properties. So, I think about things like that. I think about how it's not always very evident to everyone. It's not always universally apparent about a position on anything, really, religion, politics. It's never There's never something that's so obvious that it jumps out to all human people at one time, except save certain natural law principles, right? Like um, men and women should get married and have children because that's sort of the impetus of our biology. But in all other aspects, and we might think it's because of the darkness of sin, we have to go out looking and really weigh our epistemic systems and our religious frameworks. And what we have to do is stop committing the genetic fallacy and stop committing the sort of squint and look at it and does it seem like it would be true. We have to actually investigate our systems and interrogate them. And that is really at the heart of belief and fostering faith in these sort of post-Christian milieus that are represented in these sci-fi stories. So anyway, and this has been kind of a ramble, so I hope that you've borne with me, and I'm sure that you put up the speed on the video, because I certainly would. I don't ramble quite fast enough. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you'll leave a comment sort of pointing out what you think on this matter of discussion. At any rate, guys, this has been the Hidebound Convivium. Godspeed and God bless, and have a good rest of the day.